The last video introduced the inspiration object and talked about what it isn't, but also what it is that might be fun to play with. The 19th century is not really something I'm interested in for this project, so I think I'll stick with the early modern period. But what I am excited about is the Poisonous Cabinet, but I'm also really intrigued by the Cabinet of Curiosities, and I spent way too much time trying to combine both of those into some kind of single super build, before realizing that what I actually needed to do was split the project. The cool thing about splitting the project like this is it lets me divide it up in sort of two different kind of time streams. The Poisonous Cabinet is going to be a lot more research driven and grounded in the actual history. Research takes a long time and I don't like to rush it. While the Cabinet of Curiosities, well, that's just going to be a fun place to play around with anything that comes along. I'm going to build the cabinet into that hollowed out book that I made in the last video. It seems like a waste not to use it, and it's really kind of fun also to bring it back around. I'm also going to make the cabinet removable. That way I can make more than one. I mean, I already have at least a dozen ideas of things that I'd like to play around with. And the problem is deciding between them. So because I'm using that book as a setting for the cabinets, and because for some God knows what reason I kept most of the pages that I ripped out of it, I thought it'd be kind of fun to sort of leave it up to chance and let the book decide what the first topic was going to be. This is a really cool prompt. I'm really excited about it, and it works very well actually with a number of things that I have on hand. But the first thing I'm going to do is completely cheat, because it's my game, so why not? Because this is an opportunity to make the centerpiece of this thing refer to one of the most fascinating archaeological artifacts from the early Middle Ages, at least in my opinion. Now, I'm familiar with these from the English context, and those are the ones that I know the best. In fact, one of these lives in my local museum. And the problem with the early Middle Ages is the majority of objects and artifacts that we have from burial deposits. And that's really cool in one way, because it means we can associate the object with an actual person sometimes and know a lot more about them. But it's also a problem because we're not seeing them the way they were used in life. So it's really difficult to figure out what they were and how they were used and what they meant. So in England, these are known as thread boxes, which is how they were originally described. That was for two reasons. The person describing them, who was male, was influenced first by the fact that some of these boxes have small scraps of thread surviving in them, but also that objects in women's burials early on were mostly described as either being jewelry or as being textile tools. Those are the two categories of objects that are sort of considered the female burial ensemble. But over the past several decades, people have begun to take a much closer look and realize how much more interesting these things are. They're highly decorative. They have attachments for hanging from chains, which may mean that they were being displayed either all the time or maybe sometimes. And even though very little often remains of what was inside them, what we do get is a little bit tantalizing. It's not only scraps of thread and textile, but sometimes it's bits of plants. And the thread and the textiles are often quite fine. We find silks and things like that. Not only does this object not look like it would be a very practical thread box or work box if you were going to use it daily for things like mending, but it seems to be much more important, much more maybe powerful. So as I said, I'm mostly familiar with these from the English context, and they're not an object that I've personally actually studied. So it was really exciting when I began to do a lot more research into them for this part of the project, to discover that not only were the ones that I was familiar with, as well as a number sort of in France, in Italy, that are much more highly decorative, but certainly seem to be at least related to the ones in England, like people who had the same ideas that these objects were important. but that fairly recently there have been several that were found in Scandinavia. What's more, these Scandinavian boxes are extremely decorative. They're absolutely beautiful, and as soon as I found that out, I knew that was exactly what I wanted to do with mine. I'm linking a bunch of articles, including this one on the Scandinavian objects, so if you find them as interesting as I do, I highly recommend that you go and have a read. Obviously, I make a lot of projects that are inspired by archaeological artifacts or by events of people of the past, but I don't usually try to reconstruct the original object. I like to focus in on certain aspects of it, partly because it allows me to sort of take that object and play with it in a new way, but also because zeroing in on those aspects lets me think about the object in a new way, to come up with sort of new ideas or questions about it. And new ideas and questions are kind of the core of academic archaeology. In this case, what I'm doing is focusing mostly on the aesthetics of the thing, on the designs and the shape of it. I'm not going to be making it out of metal, and that's partly because I don't actually have that ability in my workshop. I don't have the space to set up a soldering station, but also because this is, again, it's meant to be a fun part of the project, and I want to work with stuff that is inexpensive, easy to work with, and very familiar. So like a lot of stuff that I do, I'm going to be working with cardstock. Since I'm not trying to accurately recreate one of these objects, I'm going to just sort of pick and choose from the different decorative elements that I'm seeing in these Scandinavian boxes. I'm taking this interlace band from the center of one, even though that's going to cause me some problems later on. From another box, I'm picking this lovely little hinge. And then for the top, I'm going to completely go off script. So much of this box is tied into femininity and the female gender, and I love that about it. So I'm taking these three that I'm very familiar with and you've probably seen before because they're quite famous. They're often called Valkyrie amulets, even though we don't actually know what they are. And again, I'm going to link to where you can find them below in the Historica collection.
So the last thing to do for this project is to connect the lid to the base, which will really take place with this. But in order to keep the lid shut, there needs to be closure, and that is what we're going to do now. So that's going to be done with this, which you just saw being spun, which is a really gorgeous wool that I think I'm going to bind up in some way. I still have to experiment with that, so we're going to play around a little bit with that. But I also need a toggle. And one of the things I really like to do is include things from the landscape that I'm in my project. So whilst I was in Germany, I was by a lot of farm fields, and on the fringe of those fields, not on the fields themselves, you can sometimes find some really interesting stuff. Like this is an animal bone of some kind. You can see how robust it is. And also you have these laminated layers that are actually delaminating a bit. Obviously, way too big. I thought that might be kind of interesting. I also picked up their plum trees all along the sides there. So I thought maybe a little plum pit would be fun. And then I also found this, which is a rim-shirred pottery. But then at the end of the trip, I went to Normandy, to France, and I was staying in this sweet little tiny town, and I found all of these little seashells. And the one that I really was enamored by, these are a little bit too big, is this little one, which is a little tiny, beautiful scallop shell. Now, obviously, I've already drilled it. I used this bit in this tool and just drilled a hole through it right there. I did it off camera because I was terrified, but it worked really well.